Thanks. So here's our lovely cover slide. Let me introduce you to myself and my colleagues who are going to be joining us. I'm obviously the one there on the far side, but I'm very happy to do this with Pauline and Patrick today, who I work with very closely. It's been a tumultuous couple of weeks, and we actually planned to do this last week, and then given all the executive order flurry and whatnot, we decided to postpone for a week, maybe to see if the waters would calm, or maybe just to see how what's happening is going to impact this topic. But appreciate everybody's flexibility who were planning to attend last week and now that we're here this week. So let's flip over to the next one and just kind of outline. This is what we're sort of hoping to talk about today, which this concept of employee activism is, I don't know that it's necessarily a quote defined term, but more of just what I guess I would call a trend, a reality of what we're seeing across workspaces, across industries, and things like that. So we want to kind of talk about, what from our view has led us up to this moment where we're seeing such a different sort of, I guess we'll call it water cooler conversation than what we used to see, and how are employers responding to it? What are the legal risks that arise? That some of them may be fairly obvious, some may be a lot more latent. One thing I want to mention, because of the number of people we have on, it's very hard to do sort of live questions. So the way that I want to handle that is, if you have a question, throw it into the chat. I've got the window open on my screen. I'm monitoring that. And we'll try to adjust questions as much as possible in real time rather than reserve them to the end, unless it makes sense to reserve them to the end. We'll try to make this lively. Let's flip to the next one, Liz. Before I turn this over to Patrick, let me just kind of give you a disclaimer. I know a lot of webinars and presentations like this, they can take something of a lecture format. My hope is this one's not going to go like that, because this topic really isn't like, we're not trying to explain a legal structure or a statutory scheme to you. This is kind of a idea exploration right now. So this is something that's going on. It's obviously massively affected by what has happened with political changes and, the way that we voted, and by we, I mean the entire country voted in 2016 versus 2020 versus 2024 and what that's all meant. But all that is to say, we're not the keepers of the kingdom in terms of we've got all the right answers. Our goal for this today is more to plant thought seeds and thought bubbles, right? This is the stuff that as counsel, we're thinking about and we're talking about with our clients. And there aren't perfect answers to a lot of these questions. And some of what goes on is very industry specific. It's very demographic dependent. And so what we're hoping to do is give this more. These are the kinds of things that I think are worthwhile to think about within your organization, and then identify what kind of organization you are on the spectrum of development and maybe where you should go or not go in response to that. So that's the goal. We hope it's interesting. We sure think it is. So Patrick, from there, you're up. Take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So again, what are we here to talk about today? And I think, as Chris alluded to, there's really no set definition for what employee activism is across all industries. But for our purposes today, we're going to consider it to be, and I'm just going to read this part, employees engaged in the coordinated action to address a societal problem connected to the company they work for. Typically, this is a group action, a group of employees, but there can be situations where it might be one perhaps a disproportionately loud employee that is particularly interested in a certain cause. As it relates to responses to employee activism, just as there's no standard definition of what employee activism is, there's really no standard response either. We will talk about some different types of responses that at least academics have identified based on what they've seen, but really there's no one size fits all when it comes to responses. But what employee activism most often is some sort of a concerted effort to influence specific societal events or company policies. Some of the forms at a high level: protests, social media campaigns, just communications between employees. But at the end of the day, what are the employees looking for? They're looking for some sort of change as it relates to that underlying societal problem. And that can be a little bit of a frustrating concept sometimes, because sometimes the protest or the activism can be, well, we want change. We want it to be different. But then the question might be asked, well, how do you want it to be different? And there's really no answer to that. It's just, well, we just want change. So it can be a very frustrating concept, certainly to address as an organization. So if we go to the next slide, please. Um, I don't think we did any studies, though they do exist, to tell you that over the last several years, and particularly around COVID, that employee activism has been on the rise just for a number of reasons. But I mean, this is a concept, if you just look back over the decades, that probably can even at least go back to the 70s when you think of the societal issues there, Vietnam War, et cetera. And even more recently, in the 2000s, we have the Me Too movement, which obviously created a lot of employee activist type movements across industries as well. The activism, when it comes to employee activism, can be confined to a single organization. But I think increasingly more modernly, you might see that there might be third-party organizations who might even seek out certain employees that have shown that they're willing to be employee activists, and partner up with them and help drive that. So you might have employees that have a little bit of an idea, but a third party starts working with them, and it can amplify the activism that's already going on.
Patrick, I'm just going to pop in there real
Sure.
quick too. Just one other thing to note that I think is interesting is obviously the onset of the pandemic, but the simultaneous evolution of technology tools. And we'll talk about Slack, for example, later. But as we went fully remote, generally speaking, in a lot of industries, that was happening at the same time we were learning to leveraging these kinds of tools to just work more effectively. And now we're sort of on the other side of that, and those tools just keep evolving, right? So there's a lot of technology that goes with this too.
Yes. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that going forward, but that's certainly true. Now, when we're talking about employee activism, just getting back to what we're here to talk about today, this is distinct from union activity that might be talking about terms and conditions of employment. This is not to say that unions might not ultimately get involved in employee activist issues, but when we're talking about employee activism, we're talking more about these societal issues that are across organizations rather than maybe terms and conditions for a particular employer. You go to the next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a busy slide here, a lot to take in. But we mentioned earlier that this employee activism can take a lot of different forms. This is one academic's attempt at showing across the spectrum of what sort of tactics might happen when it comes to employee activists. If you work from the left to the right, you'll see disrupting tactics that are really, that are focused on trying to make, I guess, problems within the organization that if the disruption does not stop, the organization is going to suffer, and therefore will generate some sort of response into those employee activism activities, versus persuasion tactics on the other end of the spectrum, where it's activists that are trying to sit down and actually have a dialogue with the organization to enact some sort of change. And if we work from top to bottom, we have some more innovative ways that employee activists have engaged in activism as of late. Here, some of the things that I mentioned on a previous slide, you'll see that coordination with activists and peer companies, that could be third-party organizations as well. And you'll see on the upper left here, we have unsanctioned employee poll and data collection. This can lead to, I think that some of the new technology that's out there that Chris was alluding to lends itself to that kind of a polling that maybe would have been more difficult without the technology we have now. And then down to the lower end of the spectrum, more established types of employee activism, protest, demonstration, walkouts, things that we have seen for decades and are certainly disruptive. But this just kind of is a slide to put together the different types of activism and tactics you might see in the workforce. Next slide, please. And when it comes to talk about activism, it would be foolish not to consider the generational factors that are contributing to increased employee activism in the workplace. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all. Obviously, there are exceptions to any kind of a broad, stereotype that we have on the slide here. But I think most notably, if you look at Gen Z, some of the characteristics that are typically applied to that generation is that they're progressive and they advocate for change. If we turn to the right side of the slide and look at the percentages to the right, yeah, okay, thank you. To the generations in the workforce right now, Gen Z, 5% of the workforce as it right around now, but obviously over time, as Gen Z becomes older, baby boomers will become less, Gen Z will increase. So there's a theory there that with more Gen Z in the workforce, there could be increased rates of employee activism. Next slide, please. Okay, certain trends that are leading to activism as well. Again, some thoughts and research that academics have come to conclusions on. First, rising workplace expectations, workforce expectations. Gets back to the Gen Z characteristics we were just talking about in the last slide. There is an increased desire to work in an organization that you think has common goals and purposes that you had as an individual. And maybe more so now than your previous generations did. Again, painting with a broad brush. If anybody has taken any sort of classes, whether in management over the last several years, you'll also note that empowerment is often a management principle taught in classes. And I think that's probably true. I mean, if you empower your workforce, there is a increased trust in the organization, more likely to bring new ideas forward, which can help make the organization more productive and innovative. The opposite side of that coin is that if the employees feel like they have a voice and they are empowered, if they see something they don't like, they might be more likely to come forward and with some sort of issue in society at large, and become an employee activist because they feel empowered in the workplace. All the urgent societal changes that we've kind of alluded to this point also is a trend that leads to increased activism as of late. Social justice, climate change, international conflicts, look no further than Gaza and Ukraine. All things that might lead to employees being activists in the workplace. And then again, these new technologies, we'll probably hit on this a few times. Whereas before it may have been difficult for employees maybe to find common minds, either within the organization or across organizations, that is greatly facilitated by things like social media and even just having websites in the internet now. Whereas before people may have felt isolated, and that they can now find more easily people of common mind that may be embolden them to pursue the kind of activist actions that they're considering. So next slide, I think it goes back to you, Chris.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we want to kind of go over this, why is this happening? How are we here, or how did we get here? Is this, we're talking about this in the context of legal risk, managing legal risk within your organization. But this isn't law, right? Like these are not developments that were created by statutory enactment or political policy bend. This is just like organic development of everything that has gone on around us. And so as we talk about spectrums and organizations and where you fit in, I think it's really important to understand, like, no matter what you do as an employer, this affects you because this isn't based on an industry. This isn't based on a state. This is just based on the evolution of our country and other countries internationally. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And also then that sort of leads this idea, well, how employees do this is also organic, right? It depends on what they do in terms of how are they being active. And so this is why I say, think about what your business is and what kind of employees you have. Do you do manufacturing and it's primary, like hands-on type work? Or do you have a lot of service-based work where people are working at desks and interacting through computers much more than they are, in person anymore? But even those manufacturing companies, for example, you're gonna have your desk workers and whatnot. And then you take that at the same time and say, okay, well, not only what we do, but where we do it and who works from us is going to impact the way that this plays out, in the sense that, the degree of education, for example, or skill development, or if they're in, I hate to say it, red states or blue states, that impacts things too. So you've got all of these factors that organizations, for the most part, don't have a lot of control over because they're in an industry, but they impact how this happens. Of course, it's very important to understand, just because people are, you don't have a very Gen Z or very highly educated workforce, it doesn't mean people are talking about this, right? This is all happening across the spectrum. So you don't want to make the mistake to think, yeah, that doesn't really affect us as much as it might affect a software as a service company or something like that. This is happening everywhere. It's just, it happens differently depending on what you do and what kind of people you employ to do it. So let's flip on to the next one. Okay. And, here's just some understanding again that like less than half of our current adult population thinks companies should be being front forward in terms of this is what we believe, this is what our view of on is this. But as more and more of the workforce changes and sort of the boomers and whatnot age out, and I guess the Gen X's like me are going to be moving up into the higher echelons of the workforce too. As different generations come into the workforce, that's going to impact how companies ultimately have to look at this and what the public view of this is going to be. And you see this just, a couple of highlights we had here with McDonald's and Bud Light, where because of just a choice that they made in terms of, yeah, we want to move forward with being progressive on transgender, or, oh, we want to take a stance on an international political issue, that becomes a business decision in the sense that that had a dramatic impact on actually their business. And so, not saying that was right, not saying it was wrong, but it's the sort of thing that business leaders need to account for. Like, what is the risk financially, profitability, for example, of taking a stand on these things versus the risks at a cultural level if we don't and pretend that we're just totally agnostic to this all. So let's flip over one more here. Okay. And then the other thing to think about this is there's some real interesting data that we've been seeing about the 2024 election. And I don't know, I can't remember. I saw a couple different studies on this. But one of the things that I thought was super interesting was that there was a significant number of voters who stayed home in some swing states because they were unhappy about some of the past administration's policies. Gaza was a very big one that I saw as part of the study. And yet those same voters are very, up in arms about what's going on with the new administration. And, they've been very active about things like DEI and the social and political light of all this stuff. And you've got these recent executive orders that we're going to talk about here in a minute that I think are, they're really like a fire that's being lit maybe in terms of what people are talking about. And so all of this is spinning around right now. I mean, we're seeing, the discussions that I'm even having with my colleagues at Foley in the last 2 weeks about what's going on in the world, and just, it's almost like a maelstrom of change. And how are we going to react to it? That's happening, right? And the question's going to be, what are states going to do, and where do companies fit themselves within that sort of win? Because you can't just ignore it. So let's flip over, and I'll turn it over to Pauline to chat for a bit about this stuff.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I'll start out by saying that the orders that we're going to discuss, this is not an exhaustive list. Obviously, the administration has been working pretty quickly on all sorts of different priorities and campaign promises. So this is just a small sampling of things that, everyone is going to be talking about. Certainly has been talking about over the last, week and a half since the inauguration, and will be certainly continuing to talk about. So, on in his first, couple of hours in office, and then certainly in the last week and a half, President Trump has issued dozens of executive orders. Lots of whom have hit upon these, hot button issues that people, are going to be talking about at the water cooler or over Slack or Teams or, whatever communication they're using. So the first couple involve around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then DEIA, DEI plus accessibility. So one of the first big ones was ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. This eliminates DEI programs in the federal government. It prevents federal contractors and subcontractors from considering race, color, sex, sexual orientation, religion, etc., in their offices, in their offers. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't have to comply with existing, federal or state level discrimination law. So there's obviously, Title VII, the ADA, all sorts of protections based on protective classes. But this is officially eliminating those programs within the federal workforce. The second one involves initial rescissions of harmful executive orders and actions. So this rescinds numerous Biden-era executive orders involving equal opportunity for individuals based on, race, gender identity, sexual orientation. It states that laws and practices should only refer to sex assigned at birth rather than gender. that you should only be referring to boys and girls or males and females, that there's no, we're going on back to a full gender binary. A note about this is that, recent Supreme Court precedent in the Bostock decision still prevents discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So again, it doesn't mean that you get to discriminate, but it does mean that there's orders prohibiting consideration of these policies. Liz, you can go to the next slide. The next host of orders, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, concern immigration. So the first one, much like one of the DEI orders discussed previously, is protecting the American people against invasion. So it's a revocation of multiple executive orders by the Biden administration, which were aimed at initiating immigration reform. It directs the AG in coordination with the Secretary of State and Homeland Security to prioritize the prosecution of criminal offenses related to illegal immigration. It also restricts humanitarian programs, including those related to refugees from the Russia-Ukraine war. It directs agencies to reevaluate designations of temporary protected status and to make sure they're limited in scope and duration. So those, beneficiaries of these may be people fleeing, and seeking asylum from places like Afghanistan, Lebanon, Nicaragua, Ukraine, Yemen, etc. Well, they're trying to severely limit the number of people that can come in under these programs. Then the Securing Our Borders Initiative directs Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security to prioritize the construction of physical barriers and the deployment of personnel at the southern border. It also, similar to the other order, includes the termination of catch and release police and parole programs, including a special program directed for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, which allowed individuals from those countries who have a sponsor and pass a background check to live and work in the United States under a humanitarian parole period. One more slide, Liz. And then finally, one of the last immigration executive orders is this one on protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship, which effectively ends birthright citizenship for people in two categories: those born to mothers who were in the U.S. illegally during their birth, whose fathers were not U.S. citizens or permanent residents, or those whose mother's presence was lawful but temporary and whose fathers were not U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So this includes if you're here but on some sort of a temporary program, like including a work visa, a student visa, something like that. Now, note that this has already been challenged in multiple states. The day after the order was issued, I think like 23 different states filed several lawsuits. But obviously those challenges also take time, and these situations are all continuing to develop and change, very rapidly. So
I do. There was a federal judge, though, on this last one with the birthright citizenship that has enjoined it, calling it blatantly unconstitutional. So that's the latest on that. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that one goes.
Yep.
Patrick, I think you're up here, yeah? You're on. Here we go.
Yep. Sorry, I was on mute there. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about responses now to employee activism. I'm going to get a little more academic again here. So one research has identified these three problems, and I think we'll tease these out a little bit more over the next couple of slides. But these are all mistakes, right? So these are avoids. First, denying there is a problem. This is the kind of stick your head in the sand solution, and just hoping that it's going to go away. Typically, denying that there is a problem or refusing to address a problem is only going to make the problem worse. So certainly avoid that. And then also this idea that an organization can remain entirely apolitical. Now, I think there's a balance here between remaining apolitical versus diving into the fire and running into some of the pitfalls that Chris highlighted earlier when we saw Bud Light and McDonald's, for example. So there's a balance here, right? So it's a matter of how much do you get involved, how much do you respond, versus acting like nothing is going on and just letting it being completely oblivious to the activism that might be ongoing in your organization. But But whatever solution is decided on, it should be methodical. There should be reasoning behind it. Cause and effect should be considered, pros and cons. And rushing to make the quick fix is probably going to lead to more problems. If you're in an attempt to perhaps not remain apolitical to address the problem, you could create more problems by finding a solution without completely considering the consequences for that solution. And so ultimately, the biggest challenge might be choosing which battles that you want to fight as an organization. Some may require more involvement. Some you might want to dive into more. Others you may want to stand back and maybe let things play out for a bit. So these next two slides, we're going to talk about 6 types of responses that at least the Harvard Business Review and some of their authors came across and identified across different types of responses to employee activism. The first is this non-existent. This is the head in the sand kind of response. And it really head in the sand for 2 reasons. First, you are so disconnected from your organization and your employees that you don't even know that it's happening. That's a problem, obviously, for a number of reasons, not only for employee activism, but you really just have lost kind of control of your organization. And if you don't know what's going on, you're going to have much bigger problems to deal with than just employee activism. The other might be it's non-existent, not because you're unaware of it, but you refuse to acknowledge it. So this is the head in the sand solution, right? Also, likely not the best solution, but admittedly, there may be some solution, or some instances where it's best to stand back, but typically non-existent, not the way to go. Suppression is creating this air of fear in the workplace that if you engage in any kind of workplace activism, there is going to be some sort of negative consequences for you at your job. This may seem as an easy fix to suppress any kind of activism that otherwise create problems in the workplace. But there are obviously some secondary effects here too. So if you're suppressing employee activism, you're probably also suppressing other sort of ideas and just work and collaboration that might otherwise help the organization thrive. Suppression may be some kind of appealing, and it's the heavy-handed way of dealing with something like that. But there are secondary effects and that would come from that kind of environment that certainly are to be avoided. The third here, it would be facadism. So the organization is aware of some sort of activist or societal problem that employees are trying to address. The organization pays some sort of lip service to whatever is going on. They say, oh, yes, yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we hear you. But then there's no action to follow that up. So obviously not addressing the activism in the first place, also leading to just general morale problems, trust in the organization from the employees, and all of these really at the end of the day are just morale killers. You should probably avoid these 3, but there may be some exceptions where some of these make a little piece may make sense. But generally these 3 are seen as responses to avoid. If we go to the next slide. These 3 again are more the preferred ways to address, because you're at least addressing the activism. But again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. It's not like we're just going to take one of these and do it. It might be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. First, defensive engagement. There's an activist issue going on. You reach out to somebody at Foley and say, this is happening. Foley gives you some advice about what you have to do legally, and you go up to that line and you go no further. So you're addressing the activist issue up to the point of the legal requirement, but you're just doing the minimum. You're not going any further. So in some ways, you're at least addressing the activist issue, but are you creating a solution? Probably not. And probably the activists are not going to be totally satisfied with maybe what we've seen as a half measure and not actually enacting any sort of response or letting the employees know that they're heard. The second, the dialogic engagement, this is sitting down with the activists and trying to understand, with maybe taking a curious mindset of why the activism is going on. What is a societal issue they're trying to address? And then respond to whatever those concerns may be from the employees. There can be a downside here because there could be a shift in a power dynamic. So if you sit down, you're giving the audience to the employees and the activists it could be seen as a sign of weakness. Now, I think that's taking a very negative, pessimistic view of it. But there might be going forward, they're saying, well, if I'm an activist, I'm at least going to get this audience. I'm just going to make some noise and I'm going to get to sit down and talk with leadership. But again, I think the dialogic engagement is usually at least some piece of that is a good way to approach these issues, because it gives you a way to understand what actually is going on and what's driving the activist issue. The last response here is stimulating activism, and this is actually jumping into the deep end with the activists and actually encouraging it and giving resources and getting behind whatever the ultimate issue is with the activists. Honestly, I frankly struggle to find a good example of where this might be in a good idea, but there may very well be certain instances where the culture in the organization aligns so closely with the activist issue that it makes sense to dive in and do that. But again, this is not a one size fits all. This is not you choose one and go forward. It's probably a little bit of all of these is when it comes to responding to these employee activists. So next slide, please. Okay. Underlying theme.
Patrick, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I hit one button by accident. Is making the employees feel that they're actually heard. There's a number of ways to do this. It can be conversations on a personal level between either supervisors or leadership with the employee activists. It could be a larger town hall where all the employees come in, are given the opportunity to ask questions in a group setting. Obviously, there could be some downfalls to that as well, but it's certainly an option. Or it could just be a general message out to the organization, acknowledging that there's this activist issue going on, that the organization understands, and explaining this is how the organization is going to respond. But certainly in all these instances, human resources is going to play a key role in being an intermediary between the employees and the company management. So for all the HR people on the phone, I mean, this is certainly, or on this call, this is certainly something that that I'm sure that you may, if you haven't experienced it yet, you may in the future. Next slide, please. Okay. When it comes to how to respond as well, what can be helpful is having a policy that will guide how the organization will respond to activism generally. This avoids trying like an ad hoc kind of response and just knee-jerk quick reactions when an activism issue arises. The policy should be clear that whether it be permission or prohibition about speaking out publicly against the interests of the employer. So just speaking out directly against the employer and its goals and its mission is not necessarily protected, right? So it should lay out in the policy, at least attempt to draw a line of what is okay and what is not. But it should be made very clear what is not meant to be suppressed is any sort of communications that are protected by the NLRA. So here we're talking about terms and conditions of employment. So we're not trying to suppress anything that relates to those kind of rights that are protected by law. It's more so, again, these societal issues and maybe political issues that are not protected. Underlying all this is the importance of consistency. Organizations should avoid picking and choosing the societal issues that they support. Overly supporting one versus another can lead to discrimination claims. And obviously something that every organization wants to avoid.
And I think it comes back to me then, right? So let's go over to the next one. And just so you guys know, if you're asking questions on CNN, there was a question here about receiving CLE credit. We'll get to the code on that in just a few minutes. So let's just talk about some of the legal risks. So now we do get into the law stuff, right? I said earlier that this isn't a statutory movement, but it certainly touches on some statutory risk areas to be thinking about. And this is really, to me, this is not obviously not comprehensive, but this is a lot of where they come up is that, how you orient to what's going on is itself a risk. As we saw, for example, with the McDonald's or the Bud Light situation, they made a business decision, and it might have very well been the right, interior cultural decision for them, but it had a financial consequence and vice versa. We've talked about technology, social media, how this stuff impacts relationships across diverse working groups. And by the way, I asterisk that there, not because I want to use this idea of diversity as in the D in DEI, but just the mere fact that we are all different people, no matter what we look like, no matter where we came from, no matter what age we are, one way or another, like the people we work with, we're all individual humans, and that in and of itself creates diversity because we're just different people. And then you have these relationships that come together. So I know Patrick just talked about labor relations issues. Some of those are pretty obvious. Some of them are actually less obvious, and we'll talk about that. And then a big area is when we talk about succession planning in terms of, how do we develop people? Like we've got to realize our organization is sort of in this sea where the winds are constantly changing, and how we plan to sail our organization today may be different than how we should plan to sail it in 10 years. And how do we plan for that in terms of leadership? Like that's a risk area because you may be doing it well right now, and then you may, suddenly have a big blip and it goes down from there. So let's flip over to the next one. And I talked about organization. I think this is a serious risk organization. And I brought this up with surveillance, right? Patrick and I were sitting in a presentation a couple months ago, and it was talking about the use of AI and how useful it can be for all this. And somebody was talking about, yeah, we use Slack a lot, and we're using AI to basically filter and assess our Slack conversations to learn about who we are, right? And the idea was great to me. It was, we want to know more about who we are or as an organization, what our employees are thinking, so we can be responsive to that. And my first thought was, geez, that's surveillance of what employees are talking about under the National Labor Relations Act, right? This could very well be an unfair labor practice in the service of trying to explore your organizational identity, which the goal is good, right? Same thing, where like if you are looking at ways to learn about who we are you also hearing things that you maybe wish you didn't hear, right? If you're monitoring Slack and people are talking about their disability or the fact that they call it a regulator or something, do you now have constructive notice of, as an organization, that because you're trying to assess your identity and make changes, are you creating risks like that? And then if you make changes, right? Like if you decide, okay, this is something that we need to lean into and we're going to change who we are as an organization, or we're going to try and implement some changes, not everybody's going to love that, right? No matter what you do, you're going to experience some talent bleed because of change. And people just resist change even when we're saying we want change. So that's another thing to think about is, and I'm not saying don't make change, but realize that it's going to come with consequences like this. You're going to lose some people who maybe you want to lose, maybe you don't, but you're also going to run into some employee misunderstanding. And so you, in addition to having a cultural focus on this, you should have a communication strategy that thinks through these things as much as possible. Okay, so let's flip over to the next idea here. We've been talking about technology, and again, I think my past comments on the prior slide really apply here as well. Like a lot of what you can do with technology creates incredible business utility, but it also creates a lot of legal landmines. I think Slack, for example, I know employers love it in certain industries, same with like Salesforce, things like that. But like the amount of data, the amount of communications that are now going on that aren't necessarily as well thought through because it's somebody just, typing off a missive and sending it through. Not only does that create problems that we talked about surveillance just now, but just think about the document retention, right? If you've got records of these conversations and litigation, email used to be the death of us. And I remember we used to do presentations with the exact title, and it still is. But boy, you think people are informal in email in terms of what they say. It gets even more informal when you're dealing with some of these more rapid instant messaging and other technology tools. And there's a degree of professionalism that we, as HR, as employment lawyers, we'd love to sort of keep that facade in place. But it just deteriorates when you get into rapid technology. And, you try to teach people how we do it, but this is just how generationally we are evolving, right? My daughter last night is applying for her first job. And I almost laughed because I saw her writing a cover letter. I'm like, wait, you know how to capitalize? Because literally every message she sends to me is BRB, RN, it's all lowercase. It's a whole different dialogue. And so I was kind of joking with her that you know how to capitalize your sentence. She said, well, yeah, because it's formal, right? But like, that's how she's being raised to communicate. And it's not that I'm teaching her that. It's not that I'm not teaching her that. It's just, it's happening. And that is going to percolate as more and more communications change, how they become more easy, multifaceted, how much they become, more immediate. That's all a function of technology, and it all creates risk. All right, let's go on to the next one here. You want to talk about social media for us, Pauline?
Yes. So speaking of young members of the workforce and people that like to communicate informally, social media obviously has become increasingly relevant despite the potential TikTok ban. So we recommend that everyone have a clear and consistently enforced policy. If you have a policy but you don't enforce it consistently, that's not super helpful, because then somebody can claim, well, you didn't say anything when X person posted this on Instagram, but you did say something when I did. And that's not great. And nothing on the internet ever really goes away. So again, you have a policy, amazing. You have to actually enforce it uniformly. You should be mindful of the NLRB policy on non-disparagement and protected activity, even if you're not a union employer. And also, being mindful of federal laws, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, Stored Communications Act, or SCA. These prohibit the interception, disclosure, or use of communications of another. But there are exceptions for this. So when employees voluntarily share things on their social media or on, anything else, so whether that's Instagram, Facebook, X, TikTok, etc., those same, protections don't apply. And also be mindful that there's, a common law defense of a reasonable expectation of privacy. But again, a lot of stuff is not all that private anymore. Next slide, Liz. So kind of getting to our next point on, ideological conflicts in the workplace, disagreement versus discrimination. So there's, a lot of ways that we can disagree with each other. You may disagree with things that your employees or coworkers or people you supervise may be posting, but that doesn't make it illegal for you to disagree with them. It doesn't mean that you or your company is discriminating against them. And few states have political beliefs as a protected class in employment. But ideological conflicts can lead to discrimination claims because they may bleed into protected classes that employees do fall into. So for example, with the 2024 election issues, issues related to the executive orders that we discussed earlier, there's obviously a lot of discussion about DE&I and, say LGBTQ rights, issues involving gender expression, sexual identity, issues involving, enforcement at the border, immigration issues involving police brutality. Obviously, that was a big hot topic in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. So those are all political issues, but they may implicate protected classes that employees do fall into. Same thing with issues involving Israel and the war in Gaza. People could say that, you deciding to comment on, either pro or against one of the two sides may be a function of religious discrimination. Obviously, after the confirmation of hearing of RFK yesterday, talking about vaccine mandates, that was also a big hot topic following the COVID-19 pandemic. That led to a lot of claims of religious and disability discrimination, of OSHA concerns. So there's a lot of things here that, are political issues, but easily can bleed into issues involving potential discrimination if you're not careful.
And let me just put a point on that, Pauline, too, because we're not necessarily, a lot of this is about like legal risk, right? Like managing disagreement versus discrimination and whatnot, and how you address legal risk there. But we're thinking bigger than that, right? Because even if you are perfectly, compliant with the law, you've got like every bell and whistle to protect, you're using Foley and Lardner perfectly, whatever. This is stuff people are talking about within your organization, and they are sources of conflict between people. So even if you're not dealing with legal issues, you've got sources of conflict in the workplace that just affect productivity. It affects people. And so it's not something I'm saying I've got the answers for, but it's at least something to understand. This is not just the law, right? This is relationships. All right, so let's take it home from here, right? A couple things to talk about. We talked about labor relations as being a risk area. This idea of employee activism being concerted activity that Patrick referred to at the beginning, like it's classic concerted activity. The question becomes, is it protected, right? And even if it's not necessarily considered protected currently under existing law, will it be? I think a very interesting example of this, for example, is how states are really leaning into some of these areas. You've got, I think, 11 states currently, for example, that have laws on the books preventing what are called captive audience meetings. California, for example, would have one that says you cannot require employees to come to a meeting to essentially talk about your views on union organization. You can have the meetings, you just can't require people to be there. I personally think those laws both violate the First Amendment and are preempted by the NLRA, and there's litigation challenging them. But you can see that the certain states are leaning into this stuff. And then, of course, what happens at, the NLRB is hyper political in terms of the pendulum has been swinging left then right, then left and right. And it just keeps on swinging a little harder each way. It's sort of like the opposite of momentum with a pendulum, where if it doesn't keep wound, it will slow down. Like this just gets wider and wider. Okay. So you have these sort of classic labor relations issues, but then they're bleeding into new areas too. And like we've talked about Slack, we've talked about Zoom, for example, or Teams, where you can record meetings that you have, which is meant as a productivity tool, and it can be extremely useful, but it's got some downsides too, right? If you're making transcriptions of what's said during the Zoom meeting, that's now a record. And it may be an issue in litigation. You may be on notice of things that you didn't realize because you made a recording of it. So these are just things that are happening, right? It's stuff to be aware of as how, labor relations law, we're dealing with classic stuff going back to the passage of the NLRA, but it just keeps sort of manifesting in new and different ways because of the technology. Okay, let's go next slide. Okay. And then just some more things to think about, and I think I've touched on these a little bit. It's just like what's going on at the NLRB, and like we're seeing this right now, right? Just earlier this week, the general counsel and one Democratic member were removed. The NLRB doesn't have a quorum at the moment, nor does the EEOC. So high level, they've been sort of hamstrung in terms of what they can do. In the last, 3 to 4 years, we've seen a lot of unionization and NLRA activity in atypical industries and employers where you didn't see this before. I think the Starbucks cases over the last few years is super interesting. And just how that has impacted, Starbucks, at least in my view, was sort of viewed as the gold standard for a certain type of culture. And, if you believe the news, they've lost a lot of that because of how they've responded to some of the unionization stuff that's going on there and the public relations things that have come out of it. So, and again, all this changes as the demographics of the workforce change too. I was reading that slide about generational differences, and as a Gen Xer, it's still kind of wild to me to think, man, I'm like in the upper half of the workforce. I still relatively feel young, but like doesn't matter how I feel. I've got to be aware of the fact that this stuff is happening and accept it, as opposed to, my personal reaction is, everyone's like me, which isn't true. So just things to think about in, how they affect unionized workforces in particular. So let's flip over to the next one. Okay. And then I talked about leadership development early on, right? And one of the things that I have seen is, a lot of people get promoted into management or their first supervisory jobs, mostly because they're good at the job that they are doing. And not necessarily because they're ready to be a leader, right? They don't necessarily have these kind of what I often refer to as soft skills or people skills. And so if this is something that, as an organization, you realize we want to be committed to rolling forward as the world around us is evolving, you've got to have leadership that knows how to work with people, as opposed to knows how to make a widget better than the guy next to them. And so that may require some investment in teaching somebody who's very skilled at a job and may be the right candidate for promotion that their job is not necessarily to make widgets now, it's to help other people make widgets. And how can they do that effectively, right? And just you take that all the way up to the top I mentioned earlier with this concept of the sailboat. Like if you have a leadership plan, you have a cultural plan for how you want to evolve your organization, then you've got to make sure if you should be investing in who's going to lead us and how do we make sure that they are also prepared to take on that stuff as things develop around us. So just thoughts, right? I don't necessarily have easy answers to this, but these are things to be thinking about at an organizational level. Okay, we got 5 minutes to go here. Let's get through this. Let's flip to the next slide here. Are you confounded yet? Like, I hope, my job, like I said, I think this is fascinating and there are not a lot of answers to this, but we've got to embrace the problems. And as Patrick said, there's no one size fits advice. I like the fact that he said you need to be methodical, right? And part of being methodical is having the right view of yourself. And that, if you think we have to do better is quote unquote right thinking, but it's sort of myopic. So let's go to this next one. I asked the question, what are good employers doing? Like I get that question. What are good employers doing? And the first thing I said is there's no such thing as a good employer, right? Everybody's at a different journey. They're a different organization with different issues that are confronting them. And so, this idea that we'll just do what they're doing might not be the right answer, right? And so the first step, as Patrick said, is you got to kind of decide what's your response to this stuff. And your ability to decide that is going to be impacted by what you are and what resources you have. And, some of that relates to this idea that not all of these decisions and these considerations are easy drop to the bottom line issues. And so when you are talking to leaders, when you have investors, when you have SEC disclosure, when you have a board, you're working through things that aren't necessarily as easy to justify from a data level. And I make the point earlier that I know that I can say Anheuser-Busch lost profits because of a progressive decision that they made. So that decision had a clear bottom line impact. But culturally, it might have still been the right decision in terms of what do they want to do as an organization, but that does not drop to a bottom line. And so it's very difficult to be a thought leader in this. And it's a responsibility that you got to take on if you're going to do it. Okay, so let's flip over to the next one here. Okay, once you know that there's no such thing as a good employer, you take an honest account of what you are, right? Like, where are we now? Where do we want to go? Can we get there? And part of that is it's going to be imperfect. No matter what we decide to do, and no matter what we desire to do, we're not going to get there in the way that we draw it up. It's going to have some bumps in the road. And so part of making this honest self-assessment is not just what do we want to do, but what can we actually do against the things that we control, but mostly don't control. Okay, and where do we stand in terms of our journey as an organization against this political, social, employee maelstrom? And what level of resources are we going to commit to it? And you go forward from there. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's really where we want to end it, right? And like I said, there's not a lot of hard and fast answers to this stuff. But I think the important point, and I appreciate Patrick saying this, is that you can't avoid it, right? Those first three elements of how an employer responded, we would look at those as, they may not be the best strategy, but they may be the best strategy that you have today based on your organizational resources, but you want to move forward from that. And so, as we evolve and as the world evolves us around, these are the conversations that we're having amongst ourselves at Foley. These are the conversations we're having with our clients, which is there are no answers here, but the problems don't go away. And we've just got to keep working with them. And I hope that's helpful. But otherwise, appreciate everyone's attention and presence today. I hope this was interesting for you. I see a lot of familiar faces out there in the audience, including Tom Pence, by the way, if you're still on. Good to see you on. But thanks, everybody.